Hi, hello, and welcome to Digging Up Ancient Aliens. This is the podcast where we currently investigating Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse. Do the claims hold water to an archaeologist, or are there better explanations out there? I'm your host Fredrik, and this is part 2 of the Ancient Apocalypse saga. And this time we will look into more of the monuments and different locations that Graham Hancock bring up in his Netflix series. Last time we focused more on his background, origin, and influences, but this time we will get more into the archaeological remains or places and sites that he brings up throughout the series. And this time we will focus on 3 locations. It is Gunung Padang, the Pyramid of Cholula, and the temples on Malta and a couple other of different things too. We are also joined by Dr. Bill Farley, who has been guested us in the past, and also Kayleigh from History with Kayleigh. I also want to thank Mayora Zed from Twitter, who shared their research on Cthulhu Pyramid and some myth about the site and their research, which helped me quite a lot in here. And remember that you find sources, resources, and further reading suggestions on our website, diggingupancientaliens.com. There you also find my contact info if you spot any mistakes or have any suggestions. And you also find a fully referenced transcript there for this episode and basically all the others too we have done in the past. And if you like the podcast or this video, you should like, subscribe, and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen on podcast. Even if you don't listen on podcast, just go to any podcast player, give us 5-star. That helps tremendously in the algorithms. Now, when we're finished with our preparations, let's dig into the episode. Now let's start where Hancock started the show, with Gunung Padang. And this site is located in West Java, and that's some 3.5 hours from the central city of Jakarta. Hancock claims that this site is a mystery that has to be solved. A puzzle indeed we have, but not for the reasons Graham Hancock might have intended. Now there's a rich tradition of legends in the Malay archipelago. As in many other cases around the globe, of course, there are legends about this site's particular, Gunung Padang. For example, the Sudanese people tell stories about King Silvangi, who tried to build a palace there during one night. And while Hancock usually sees things from a mythical lens, we don't see it that much in this episode. Or do we? His primary theory in this section is that there once was a vast and powerful civilization before the deluge in Sundaland. Now, did he come up with this theory by himself? Well, as we learned in the first part, Hancock have been heavily inspired by theosophic writings. So is it a big surprise that the theosophist C.W. Leadbeater wrote in his book The Occult History of Java that Java once was part of an Atlantean colony that was attached to the Asian mainland? And just because an idea is presented in an esoteric book, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. So let's see what Hancock has to claim about the site and what his evidence really is. There are 3 claims in the show that we will look into here: that the Gunung Padang is a pyramid, that it's human-made, and C14 dating show that the site's construction could be as old as 9000 BCE, or maybe even 20,000 BCE. Let's start with the first idea that Gunung Padang is a human-made pyramid. And since it was rediscovered in 1979, excavation has taken place basically ever since. A couple of hypotheses has been tested, and since no grave has been discovered within the complex, it's usually agreed today that this site is a Punden Berundak. This would make sense since this type of structure is found across the West Java. Punden Berundak is a megalithic structure whose name translates to basically glorified person. And these structures are similar to a step pyramid in the sense that they are pyramid formed, and have different platforms going up, but they are used as a part of an ancestral worship. And this tradition was most active with the megalithic sites during the Paleometallic era, and sometimes referred to the Indo-Malayan Bronze Age. This period is usually said to be around 500 BCE to 500 AD. So Gunung Padang is one of many structures with this shape within the area, but the largest due to the incorporation of the 885 meter tall natural hill. You also have Lebak Sedang, Arkadumas, Bukit Kasur, and many more megalithic structures in the same type of tradition. We also see connection in later Samoan tradition of mound building that takes place around 1100 CE. And before we go any further, I want to make something clear here, and you will understand this a bit more as we go on through the episode. The Pundan Barandak theory is entangled with a sort of regional naturalism or a sense of regional superiority. Now, the manufactured part is on top of the hill. We find 5 enclosures where archaeologists would agree that we see artificial structures, but the rest of the hill is a natural phenomenon. Since it's a base of a volcano, the columnar joints we see throughout the episode would not have needed to be brought in. Hancock makes a point that columnar joints are normally vertical, while there are many examples where columnar joints are vertical. Look, for example, at the Devil's Causeway. You will notice that quite clear there. But there's, of course, other examples where they are not vertical. And the cracks that create the columns appear where the lava flow cool. And we see this, for example, in the supposed retainer wall that he presents in the show. And what Hancock and Dr. Hillman refer to as mortar is, according to volcanologists, traces of natural weathering, and that the site is based on a volcano would explain the cave Dr. Hillman claims are in the center of the hill, and from all the evidence we have, it looks to be a natural lava tunnel. So we can partially agree with Hancock here that the site is artificial, but it's not a pyramid and has never been intended to be a pyramid in that sense. And the construction used the local available stones on the hill to construct this Pundan Barandak, so that we don't know the function or refuse to accept its manufacture is a rather strange claim from Hancock, to be honest. But note that this hill is an ancient volcano again, and the stones we see here are found within the neck of the volcanoes, and that the site is part of here. And now for the dating of the site, and of course things take a bit of a darker turn here. Much of the episode is spent with the geologist Dr. Danny Hillman Natavidjaya. He was, together with lead archaeologist Ali Akbar, responsible for an excavation that took place between 2011 and 2014. Both appear throughout the episode as experts on the site, but this excavation has not been without its fair share of criticism. And to understand the C14 datings and the context they were taken within, we need to look closely at how they excavated the site. I first want to pause and reflect, and we should take notice that archaeology can and often are used for political gain. Indonesia is a post-colonial state. While the first president, Sukarno, was trying to build a nation based on economic freedom from the West, empires from the pre-colonial past was used to strengthen the legacy of his regime. That archaeological claims has been used to support nationalistic ideas is far from new. Neither is sponsoring a pseudo-archaeological claim to boost your national image. We saw this, for example, in Bosnia with Semir Osmanagic's pyramid in Visoko. And we have another connection. We see how funds from the state is used to support one of these fringe ideas, both in Bosnia and both here in Indonesia. So the research team at the Gunung Padang received 3 billion rupiah in initial funding. Now, it sounds like a lot. It's not too much when we convert this to US dollar, but compare this 3 billion to the 4.6 billion rupa Bandung Archaeological Center get to cover their research and salary for a whole year. And this is supposed to, well, include the salaries, projects, excavations, conservation, and everything else. And the research team at Gunung Padang got 3 billion for the first year, basically. And there's no secret that the excavation of Gunung Padang was ordered by the then sitting president Sisulu Bambang Yudhoyono. As Silius Dovati and Fove wrote, the Yudhoyono administration utilized symbols and landmarks to try to bolster a national identity. Yudhoyono wanted a symbol that could be used and considered to be older and bigger than other famous monuments like the pyramids of Giza. And we see different nationalistic activities take place throughout excavations. They have flag raisings, they have salutes, they have high-ranking official. They even named part of the excavation Operation to honor red and white. Now, but even if an excavation has a political agenda, they could still theoretically do good research. So is it the case here? And the more we look at it, the more it becomes clear that this was not the case, unfortunately. They went for a rather destructive excavation with a lack of general oversight and methodology. Samples were taken and analyzed without motivating their relevance or context even. And there's cases of recent items or more modern items contaminating the excavation. For example, a coin that turned out to be from the mid-1900s was dated by the excavation team to be from a layer or within a layer that they had dated to 5200 BC. And the find was not even in situ in the first place, and there was never any good reason for placing the item in that layer even. And they didn't even talk to other archaeologists to see if their theory was correct, or even numismatics, the people who study coins, but decided that this was an ancient amulet and evidence of this ancient culture that they were trying to find on the site. And there's more reports of items not found in situ but would rather just appear among the excavation teams. And this isn't really too surprising if you have in mind that they had up to 500 volunteers. None of them really had the experience with archaeology, or is unknown their level of experience. As for the C14 dating, we have a similar pattern of mistakes. There are, for example, 2 core drillings, but we're only sure where Dr. Hillman have taken one of these, creating a bit of a context issue here for us. And the dates look strange when we look at these 2. For example, we see old date that's mixed with the younger dates within the core. And the 2000 BC or 20,000 BCE date that's thrown around within the show is from drill core number 2 at a depth of 7 meters. And we get then later a calibrated date on 11,600 BCE at only 8 meters. And this sequence in the core closes out on yet another 20,000 BCE date. Now, I like to note that these extreme dates are sometimes within the core just separated by a couple of centimeters. While it's plausible, it's highly peculiar, to say the least. It's not really something we would expect to see, especially with these long time ranges within the core. Hillman isn't really noting this in any documentation that we have access from within his archaeological digs. And as we previously mentioned in another episode, core drillings are sensitive to contaminations. Furthermore, the researchers doesn't seem to know what they are testing. Context is everything within archaeology. We need to know what we're testing and within what context. But the team is just noting that this is organic matter that they have, for some reason, decided is from the construction of the site without giving us any, deeper explanation for it. But since Hillman and Ali Akbar's team has rounded the quality control that is peer review, the data we have is quite scarce from the excavation, unfortunately, and they have systematically only speaking with media outlets like the news or papers, blogs, the popular media, so to say, instead of publishing it to journals. Add to this a lack of attention to stratigraphy and insufficient documentation when removing columnar joints and general site destruction. We have parts of the site that now have been rendered rather useless for future scientists. And this is an excellent example of what happens when you're doing an excavation for the wrong reasons. Dr. Hillman went to the site to find his Indonesian Atlantis, and the regime paid Hillman to find a nationalistic monument that would rival the pyramids of Giza. And it becomes pretty evident, read Hillman's book Plato Never Lied, Atlantis in Indonesia from 2013, that he was out to prove his idea all along, no matter the cost, basically. And evidence that might disprove his hypothesis has been left out or explained away. So I find it almost a little bit unseemly when Hancock uses this date without context to prove his hypothesis. In the episode, they never mentioned the excavations or the obscene amount of money they got to create them. Instead, he go for this idea that the discovery is getting silenced when they don't really share their discoveries with the other. But this approach, of course, fits Hancock quite well because he can then claim that archaeologists refuse to look at the evidence even though the evidence wasn't really shared with us from the start. And before we go to the next part, I want to welcome back our next guest. So I want to welcome Dr. Bill Farley, who has been a guest previously. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. I was on the show previously when we were just making fun of an episode of Ancient Aliens. It'll be fun to talk about some different stuff today. So I'm excited to be back. Thanks for having me.
So you're an American archaeologist. So you're part of the conspiracy, according to Hancock.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess we get a bit nuanced part here. But since you were watching Ancient Aliens with us before, would you maybe want to share some differences you noticed between Ancient Apocalypse and Ancient Aliens?
Yeah, there's some interesting similarities and differences. I think, I'm sure as you've noticed, there are a lot of similarities. It borrows a lot of the same visual language, which is to say, just sort of basic documentary style, which I think is meant to lend it credibility in the same way. But I think a big distinction, an important distinction between the two, is that Ancient Aliens is more overt in its reaching out to, let's say, conspiracy theorists, right? It knows what it is, and it's not pretending really to, at least it's not pretending in overt ways. It subtly pretends to be something it's not with its use of visual language and filmic language to try and the way it uses the language of documentarians to lend itself credibility. But I think Ancient Apocalypse, maybe because it's on Netflix, maybe because of Hancock and his particular approach to this that goes back decades in his writings, much more tries to play a careful game with how it presents its evidence. It's things that are not backed up. Let's say things that are not backed up by evidence, right? Hancock will sort of quite cagily say, he'll use real archaeological sites, and he'll often give lots of real context for them, which Ancient Aliens does a little bit, but Ancient Aliens usually is very quick to abandon whatever archaeologists say and go straight into, but what if there was an intergalactic alien war? And that's the reason why this is referencing back to the episode of the show that I was on, right? Where we were talking about, people hiding in underground tunnels, exactly, which is a site that Hancock talks about in the documentary too, which I thought was a neat little fun connection. But Hancock will spend much more time talking about the archaeology. He brings on guests who are ostensibly archaeologists, who it's trickier to put into the territory of crackpot. I think it's just a smarter show. It's designed for a more modern audience, and it's designed to draw people in who maybe don't have a lot of experience with archaeology, because a lot of it, and I've seen this so much in comments on my YouTube videos and on Twitter and everywhere where all this discourse is happening, people will say again and again, I don't know, this stuff doesn't sound so crazy to me. It sounds perfectly legible. And you have to have kind of a pretty decent archaeological knowledge before you can start to pull apart some of his cases. And Ancient Aliens, I think, is much less so, right? It's easier to look at that and go, "This is ridiculous," right? It's much easier. So makes our job easier a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, but the difference between where were we, Ancient Aliens and Ancient Apocalypse is, well, they're not trying to sell it to a new audience. They want the conspiracy, the David Icks, the alien crowd who already believe in it, while Ancient Apocalypse more put itself as, I'm just asking questions, and
Mhm.
this is a sciencey show. Well, Hancock maybe don't want to be a scientist, a historian or archaeologist, but he wants to present himself as presenting a scientific idea,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
to say.
Yeah, it's like the audience. Ancient Aliens, I think, is looking to speak to insiders who are already alien people, who are already conspiracy theorist people, who are just into that stuff, whether seriously or not, right? Like sometimes people just watch that stuff for fun, and I get that, right? That's okay. People just watch that stuff the same way they might watch X Files, and they know that it's
Yeah.
all BS, and they're just having a good time with it. And I think maybe the thing about Ancient Apocalypse that's a tiny bit more insidious is exactly what you just said. Like they're reaching for an audience who don't realize what they're watching is what it is. They think it's something different, and that's a little bit alarming, I think.
Yeah, and he's using quite clever method. For example, he always claimed that he is hated, that we're trying to suppress him, closing down because he's on to the truth of everything. And scientists are always trying to keep a status quo. For example, he brings up Clovis quite a lot. Would you want to speak a little bit to the people who might not be familiar with the Clovis?
Yeah, he brings up this issue of Clovis and the quote unquote Clovis first theory, and he doesn't give us a ton of background on that. And the context for this is really deep, and it's something you learn in school if you're going to school for archaeology in the United States, because it's an important part of the history of archaeology. But it's
Hmm.
a kind of a it really is that it's a part of the history of archaeology. Why should we care about this? Well, Hancock has made this a centerpiece of his argument because a huge part of the show, and I would say this is a difference from Ancient Aliens too, is like you were saying, there's a kind of a victim complex element, and I think that's an intentional structuring of the show. Like, oh, I'm against the establishment, and he has to paint archaeologists as somehow this cabal of secret secret keepers and or at the worst intentional secret keepers, and at the best just really really doctrinarian and old fashioned and like stick in the mud, unable to change. And so to that end he brings up a couple of different elements, things that have a little kernel of truth. And one of those is this Clovis first theory. And the Clovis first theory is, as its name suggests, it's a theory about the peopling of the Americas. So it
Hmm.
was a theory that was the leading theory in archaeology for some number of decades in the middle of the 20th century, about how humans first came to North and South America. So the very distant ancestors of Native Americans, where did they come from, and how did they get here to these continents? Because there's these big oceans separating them, and the archaeological evidence suggested that happened a long time ago, but relatively recent compared to say somewhere like Africa or Southwest Asia or much of Asia, right? And so the theory was, the Clovis first theory argues, is it's the one everybody's heard of, right? That during the
Hmm.
last ice age, the Bering Land Bridge was exposed because of lower sea levels. People came across the Bering Land Bridge down through the ice-free corridor, which was this space that was opening between the two ice sheets covering what's now Canada, and then sort of highwayed down into North America and South America. And it's a very elegant theory. That's the word I always use for it in class. It's nice because everything happens at just the right moment. There's all these
Yeah.
climactic shifts, and at just the right moment, we've got the Beringia is still exposed. The ice-free corridor is opening. Clovis cites these sites that have this very distinctive material culture, including the really famous Clovis Point, these big long lancelet points with a big flute up the center, start to appear all over North America right around 12,500 years ago. So all of this sort of works. It seems to It seems to just work just right. Except then some sites started to emerge. Archaeological sites started to be explored. And in the 80s and the 90s, particularly, sites like Mesa Verde and Paisley Caves, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and a few others all over North America and South America that sort of started poking holes in this theory, mostly just because the sites were too old. They were 13,500, 14,000 years old. They were just too old. They didn't make sense. And there was a huge debate in archaeology at that time about whether those sites were real. They needed to have extraordinary evidence, which I think was reasonable, because you were undoing many decades of archaeological hypothesis to do that. And there was an intense debate, and some archaeologists were really unwilling to change their ideas about this. But over time, those sites have been tested more and more and more, and more sites have been founded, and even older sites have been founded. And archaeologists also started to do things like listen to indigenous people more often, and indigenous people were saying, we think that our ancestors have been here longer. And all of these things together really led to a paradigm shift, a big flip over, in which the Clovis first hypothesis is no longer the dominant theory in archaeology. And it hasn't been for probably around 25 years, about a quarter century. Are there still Clovis first holdouts? Absolutely. Of course there are. That's science.
Yeah.
There's always going to be difference of opinion on this. But the majority of archaeologists nowadays do accept that the Clovis first theory is not adequate for explaining the earliest peopling of the Western Hemisphere. So bringing that back to Hancock, and hopefully I'm not being too long-winded here. It is a little bit of a complicated idea to explain. Bringing that back to Hancock, he wants his viewers to believe that archaeologists still believe in Clovis first and are unwilling to change their minds, because or at least to point to this time when there was a great debate about this and say, that's how archaeologists are. They never change their minds. They're never willing to accept new information. Look at how they treated Jim Adavazio and the folks excavating Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. Right. Look at, and, is there a kernel of truth in that? Was a guy like Jim Adavazio treated badly, and that site was given an extraordinary level of scrutiny? Probably. But first of all, it was a quarter century ago. And second of all, ultimately, I think in many ways, Clovis first is a case study for why Hancock is wrong about this, because when the evidence continued to build, archaeologists did change their mind. And today, the majority position has totally shifted. And most archaeologists do believe in a pre-Clovis occupation of North and South America. So I just don't think it holds water. So he's creating a straw man there, right? But it's a straw man with a kernel of truth, not to mix several metaphors wildly. But it's a straw man with a kernel of truth at the heart of it. So that's my thoughts on that. But others maybe would disagree with me, but I think that's what's going on there.
If you start to look at people disagreeing, you will find it in all places of life, and even among archaeologists. For example, what's his name? Eric Thompson, who was quite vocal against how we interpreted the Maya script before it broke in the 70s, there somewhere. So there's been these people trying to hold back, but they've always failed when all the report studies starting to come in, because that's how science works. We correct it when we get better information. So he's somewhat telling a half a story and then want to sell you that, oh, look how they never change, as you mentioned here. And he also have had a bit of a false tactic in how he approaching criticism. He refuses it most of the times, but some of his followers have done a bit of a grassroots movement that you've seen a bit of the rougher end of, especially with ratemyprofessor.com, for example. Would you want to share your experience with the website? And
this whole thing got quite nasty, and how much of this lays on Graham's shoulders, I think, is hard to say. But those of us who have been critical of the show, and I think people have really been pretty mild-mannered about this. I mean, what did I do? I made a couple of YouTube videos that sort of talked about it and just tried to give some context, in which I talked about things like Clovis. And those YouTube videos got some traction. They got a lot of views, and that that put me in the crosshairs of a couple of people. Probably most obviously is a very large YouTuber who goes by Bright Insights, guy named Jimmy Corsetti, who's regular on Joe Rogan. He's a buddy of Graham's, but he likes to get down in the mud a bit more than some of these other guys. Graham has this very like, I don't do these sorts of things, and like I'm going to have long debates about who I will debate with on the Joe Rogan show, and he sort of tries to stay above this. But Jimmy's more a down in the mud sort of a guy, and we had some sort of an exchange on Twitter, and then he blocked me. Whatever. I thought that was the end of it. Okay, whatever. You interact with a person, somebody blocks you. I never will knock somebody. Somebody wants to block me. That is their right.
Yeah.
I block people when I don't want to talk to them anymore. I don't care. But he then went and we all have this was not hard to screen cap. He went on Twitter, and so this guy, just to give you a little context, this guy has like 1.5 million YouTube subscribers. He has a very large following, and he went on and he sort of went to his followers and he said, "Hey, I think we should get dirty with these guys." And he wasn't talking about me specifically. He was sort of saying all of this whole group of people who were criticizing him and Hancock and others. And he had specific suggestions. You should go and write fake reviews about their books. You should write fake Rate My Professor reviews. You should call up their HR and pretend to be a student and make stuff up about them, try and get them fired from their jobs. Pretty nasty stuff. And just about I had about just about all those things happened to me. Most publicly was my Rate My Professor reviews were review bombed. So it's relatively low stakes here. But I got something like 15 or 20 very fake Rate My Professor reviews, 1-star Rate My Professor reviews, with really nasty stuff in them, hilariously fake, writing things that no student would ever write about classes I don't even teach anymore, and just obviously factually incorrect stuff. Rate My Professor took some of them down, but have left about a half dozen of them up, which has ruined my Rate My Professor page and my scores, and refuses to take them down or even reply to me. They don't even they won't reply to my messages and my request to talk to them or give them evidence of what happened. So that remains there. So this is the stuff you got to deal with, I guess, if you want to criticize stuff on the internet. I think if you take a look at the criticisms I've had, they've been pretty fair and pretty mild, but they certainly pissed off some people. So yeah, that's been my. That was an annoying couple of days where I was on the phone with my university HR and the university police department and having to talk to them about all this stuff. It was stressful. It was stressful, but it is what it is. It's no big deal.
Understandable. But the university can't help with ratemyprofessor.com or
they can't with that. I mean, the university was great, and I spoke to my dean and all those people, and they were like, listen, if we're gonna get fake calls from people, like, that's not going to affect you. We know what's going on. First of all, this stuff happens. This is not unusual for academics, actually. And some academics work in much more contentious fields than we do, right? And they get a lot of this, this kind of, and also, of course, my colleagues who are women or people of color get orders of magnitude more of this crap than I do. So I'm getting a taste of it for sure, and it's unpleasant. It makes me more empathetic. But they're like, we've this is not our first rodeo, so to speak. And they knew what was going on. But Rate My Professor is just some website. It's just some business, or whatever. And it seems to be running kind of on autopilot at this point. It seems to be they're just letting algorithms do everything. And I don't know. I don't think there's any actual humans there answering the messages anymore.
I think it's, from when I looked into the site, it looks abandoned. It's don't really have a parent company, really. Nobody seems to care it. As long as it's running and give them some ad revenue, they seems
to
perfectly
be like
happy.
Most of their help pages are just broken web links, so you're trying to find, who can I send an email to so that I can have a conversation and explain what happened. And it's just, you can't do it. There's no way to do it. So I was reduced to adding them on Twitter and sending them Instagram messages, which they completely ignored. So it is what it is. I don't know. I don't think
the warning signs on a website that you can't contact anyone, not really give them a lot of credibility at the end of the day.
I don't think so. And I don't get the impressions that students value it that much. There was a time maybe 5-10 years ago when it was an important tool, and I just don't know. I just don't know if it is anymore. I don't think many students use it anymore. So, sorry, right, my professor. They probably would if you treated yourself with a little more respect. That's just me.
So, what rating would you give Ancient Apocalypse?
You know, it depends on how. I'm going to give you a real weaselly answer. It depends on who's rating it. In some ways, I think it transcends Ancient Aliens a lot in its reaching for legitimacy and credibility. The getting on Netflix, and of course, we all know I don't know. There's some questions about how he got it on Netflix, right? He's got some familial connection, shall we say? I don't
Yeah.
know. I have no idea if those were utilized. Maybe not. I don't want to, but it raises some questions, right? But the show was on this really mainstream platform. It's
Hmm.
a higher production value, I think, than anything that Ancient Aliens has ever done. It's smarter about how it presents its arguments to make them seem more reasonable, and to reach out to a broader audience of people who maybe aren't already quite invested in these alternative hypotheses, shall we say? But so you could see that as well. That's really an improvement. They really did a good job. Or you could say, wow, that's extra manipulative and gross, and rate it even lower. So it depends on your perspective, I guess. The show is certainly very slick in how it was made and how it was produced, how it was advertised, and
Hmm.
how it was put out there. But in other ways, I think it's really disingenuous, and it does a lot of things falsely that it knows it's being false about, and it does it anyway. So that I don't care for very much. So
Thank you for your time. I will let you get back to your work. You're starting your day.
yes, yep,
But
off to everything.
well, thank you for your time. It was very appreciated.
Yes, thank you for having me back. Anytime you want to chat more, I'm around.
Thanks again to Dr. Farley, and you should go back and listen to his previous appearance back in episode 12. Links to his YouTube channel and all the other good stuff can be found in the show notes. So let's get back into the program. Hancock brings us across the globe to a place famous for its hot sauce and having the largest pyramid on Earth. Welcome to Cholula, located in Puebla, Mexico. This might not be the tallest pyramid in the world, measuring only some 25 meters or 82 feet in height, but by volume, it's the grandest of them all. The sides measure 315 times 300 meters, or 1033 times 984 feet, and were built around the late Preclassic Mayan period, almost simultaneous as Teotihuacan. We can see the influences of this larger city on the Cholula pyramid in its earlier stages. They use, for example, the architectural style talud tablero, meaning that they have part of the wall sloping, then followed by a straight section. Now, Hancock Visits brings us some excellent film of the locations and the tunnels within the Cholula pyramid. Sure, one could discuss the Azteca and Concheros dancers' clothes. We will glance over that part for now. This is a topic that we might revisit one day, but not today. Now, Hancock's dating for the site isn't really too strange, to be honest. He says it's to 500 BCE. While it's a little bit off and he doesn't really give any reason for the date, it's not way off actually. Usually the pyramid is dated to between 400 BCE and 200 BCE, but the 200 BCE date is more likely since it's based on ceramics found at the site that we can date. And Graham spends most of the time just walking around the tunnels beneath the pyramid, and they bring up a small spring. Hancock claims it's beneath the Cholula pyramid, but in reality, it's more to the west side of it. And this is a natural spring that feeds into a marshy area that's just a little bit regress beside the pyramid. And if you have been with us sometimes or well read on Maya mythology, you might recognize this scene a little bit from the Creation myth. We have what could be described as a ball cord from where the mice god sprung. And water is an essential part of the Maya rituals, as we discussed in an earlier episode. So it's not strange that they build a temple so close to a water source, a spring. And we should note that Hancock wishes that the pyramids have something more in common than just the shape. Hancock says the problem is that these structures are universally associated with very specific spiritual ideas. What happened to us after death? Now, in Graham Hancock's minds, all the pyramids of the world have a common idea that brings them together: death and the afterlife. And since they all share this idea, it's impossible that these structures developed independently by the different people living in the regions. But there's an issue, of course, with Hancock's reasoning. The pyramids aren't all connected to death or the afterlife. Sure, the Egyptian pyramids were about death, and many other of the pyramidal buildings are connected to the religion or different ceremonies. And sure, religion tend to claim to have answers to what happens when we die or after we die, maybe more. But that's as close as we get to this idea of this pyramid symbols death and afterlife. For example, the pyramids in Mesoamerica were more connected to life. The Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan commemorates the creation story, for example, and the sacrificing taking place on the pyramids throughout Mesoamerica was to ensure the continuation of life and to celebrate life. And the mounds of North America were filling several different functions, ranging from ceremonial locations for longhouses, meeting places, etc. It's not correct to attribute them to only what happens when we die or an afterlife. We have the temples in India and Cambodia that have religious connection, but not really connected to either death or the afterlife. Sure, they're part of the religion where those questions are answers, but these buildings themselves aren't connected to that part of the religion. And then we have the pyramids in China that we again see are used as tombs. So there we have the death. But what Hancock does here is cherry pick the data so it fits his narrative, leaving out the misses and only focusing on the hits. The same thing that he accuses archaeologists of doing. Isn't that a little bit funny? Isn't it? But let's move into Hancock's favorite pastime, looking at myth from an esoteric lens. You see, there is a legend that giants built the pyramid of Cholula after 7 of them survived a great deluge. And the first and only account of this story is written in a book called Ophilotheria, published in 1899. In it, the anonymous author retells a report from a nameless Dominican priest who visited Cholula in 1566. And the story shows signs of Christian influence, something not really uncommon when they in the past retold the pagan myth. For example, Snorre Sturlason's Poetic Edda does the same with the Nordic pagan myth. We must remember that objectively writing down scholarly material is a relative fresh idea in a sense. Even if giants appear in the Mesoamerican creation story, their portrayal is very different from what we see in this anonymous source that Hancock refers to here. Also, while there's some connection to a great flood within Mesoamerican religion, it's just one of many different ways the world gets destroyed. We have the deluge, but in another world, it was destroyed by dogs, for example. Now we need to evaluate myth critically. Some might have good information, sure. Lipo Hans and Hua recreation of how the Maui statue could have been moved is based on legends but viewed from a critical lens. So archaeologists do use legends, but we need to look at them more objective. And something we should address before we move on to our last stop for this episode, I want to again bring up this idea of Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl. At least Hancock in this series doesn't claim that Quetzalcoatl was a white man any longer, at least, but he still has this idea that this god came from the east. Now, within Mesoamerican mythology, Quetzalcoatl has two sides basically. one part creator slash destroyer of the universe, and one part is a cultural hero. Now, what Graham Hancock seems to do is to confuse the hero part of the story with the god part of the story. Quetzalcoatl as a culture hero is a bit confusing since it talks about a ruler, sometimes referred to as One Reed or Tolptzin Quetzalcoatl. The demise of One Reed varies depending on the version and when it was told. In some versions, the end of Quetzalcoatl or One Reed is that he sailed east or west, burned himself up, became the morning star, moved to Tliplapan, became sick and just died, or split the ocean, just like Moses did. Again, we have captured Hancock in a sort of orchard filled with cherry trees. And the idea that Quetzalcoatl was white is an invention from Geronimo de Mendieta, a Franciscan missionary and chronicle who lived between 1522 and 1604. In his work Historia Ecclesiastica, Indiana, Volume 2, Chapter 10, we learn about some of the histories of Quetzalcoatl. The Mendieta probably based this on a now lost writing of Andres de Olmos, another priest operating a bit earlier than the Mendieta. But in this chapter, we learn that Quetzalcoatl, or Kukulkan, was described as followed. He was a white man, tall in body, broad forehead, large eyes, long black hair, and large round beard. Now let's head over east from Mesoamerica to the Mediterranean Sea. And just south of Sicily, we have three islands, Gozo, Comino, and Malta. This little island nation is home to some of the oldest known megalithic structures. And we covered these buildings recently in an episode called Aliens and Ancient Engineers. And what's interesting is that Hancock's claims doesn't differs too much from the old Ancient Alien episode. We still have this idea of an outside force coming to the islands and helping these poor farmers who've never built anything bigger than a shack. And the funny thing is the Ancient Alien proponents agree with the mainstream interpretations of the date of the sites, while Hancock does not, as we will learn here. But Hancock, he disagreed with the conventional dates, putting the site to 3600 BCE and 3200 BCE. He admits that there are datable artifacts and things from the sites, but he just handwaves them away, saying of course, these parts were built later, but the rest of them is built a lot earlier, of course. And the director of the show does a great job giving the impression that these sites have been barely investigated. But there's actually been ample dating on these sites. There are both optically stimulated luminescence testings. So we test quartz, for example, to see when it was subjected to sunlight. And when we perform this test, the dating lands about 3600 BCE to 3080 BCE. Add to this the accelerator mass spectrometry, a form of carbon dating that have given us dates in the past between 3600 BCE and 3200 BCE. But the date Hancock wants is around 10,000 BCE. So he have set out to find someone who agrees with him on this date. And Hancock does a little sneaky thing here again, claiming that we will use archaeoastronomy, which is a real thing, or, well, Graham calls it the knowledge of the ancient. Now, in reality, he is not really using archaeoastronomy in that sense here. If he did, it wouldn't really fit with his theory. Instead, they interview a Dutch juridical translator by the name of Lenier Regic. And Regic believes that the temples on Malta align with the brightest star, Sirius. And to get this theory to work, the construction type of the temples, according to Fredrik and Hancock, we need to push the date back of the building of the temples to 9000 BCE. The reason why they select this date is unclear, because some temples would align more if we placed it in 5350 BCE or 4250 BCE. But we could also use other signs on the stars, for example, oriented temples towards Centauri, the equinoxes, or the solstices. Why these orientations are not viable is never explained or even presented within the show. They also leave out that the Southern Cross lines up a lot better with all the temples on Malta, in contradiction to the Sirius alignment that would only work with some of the temples. And even then, if the date would be moved back, the Southern Cross or the Crocs would make more sense for the Maltese sailors, since they used this to navigate to and from Sicily. And using the Crocs as alignment also fits with the time frame from when we know that the temples were built within our dating. However, Hancock has an ace in the arm. There's evidence of earlier human habitation than scholars have thought, or well, human-like habitation. Now, in a cave of Gar Dalam, 2 teeth were found in 1917 by Mr. G. Despot and identified as Neanderthal. And this was based on the teeth perceived pulp chambers or turodontism, but this identification was never replicated, and it seems to have been wrong from the start. It doesn't mean that it's impossible that Neanderthal lived on Malta. They were across Europe. Of course, they could have come to Malta, but we don't have any evidence for it. Plausible? Yes. Proven? No. Not yet, at least. Maybe one day in the future, but of course, we need some evidence first. These teeth were not the case. And I will gloss over the cart rots here that he brings up in the episode, because I went into them in greater detail in the earlier episode on Malta. But as the research stands right now, it's most likely actual marks from carts hollowed out more by erosion over time. And to close this segment out, Hancock comes up with a quite interesting remark in the show to get a connection between Malta, ancient Egypt, and Osiris. He claims that the boats on Malta have the iron Horus painted on them. Some looks like it on the modern vessels, but the tradition does not originate from Egypt. It actually originates from Greece and Rome, and these eyes were to ward off envy and harm, concepts that were well known in Greek and Roman literature. So Hancock's Osiris connection topples over like a cow in the night. Now, to close out the show, I want to introduce our next and last guest. So I want to welcome to the show Kayleigh from the YouTube channel History with Kayleigh. Would you maybe want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself if they're not familiar with you already?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Kayleigh. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm 31. I'm officially a high school dropout, but I've been passionate about history since I was young, especially the Stone Age. So when I got about 10 years ago, I had a surgery that made me unable to work. So I started researching things in my free time because I had a lot of that. And eventually I decided to create videos on the research that I was doing. So that led to me creating my YouTube channel, and I started making videos on structures from the Stone Age. And eventually it led to me doing a whole lot of other things. And earlier last year, I started doing anthropology on my channel, and that's currently my focus. But I still love the Stone Age structures and the mystery surrounding them. So I decided to review the Ancient Apocalypse series from Graham Hancock on Netflix. And I'm making a review for every episode. I'm making one video. And eventually I will have covered everything and looked at the facts and the fiction.
Were you familiar with Hancock before you started the reviewing project, or was he new to you as a history learner?
He was definitely not new to me. I've been following his work for about a decade now. And yeah, of course, in the beginning, I was quite intrigued and I thought that maybe he's onto something. But the more I looked into things myself and researched them for myself, I learned that a lot of things that he's saying is very embellished and not necessarily based on factual evidence. So, yeah, I mean, I've seen his podcasts on the Joe Rogan Experience. I'm very familiar with him. It's just that for the videos on Ancient Apocalypse, I only look at what he says in the show and I don't focus
Okay.
on anything outside of the show. Because for the people that aren't familiar with him, they're only going to see the show at first. And based off of that, they're going to eventually create their opinion. And I didn't want to, how do I say that? I didn't want to make sure that people that weren't familiar with him heard things that they didn't see in the show.
Understandable approach and a bit different than maybe some others have had to the show. What did you feel when you saw the episode? Did you feel that it's more, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ancient Aliens and those type of documentary. How do you feel it compares to these more extreme pseudo claims compared to Hancock? Is Hancock more easily to get sucked in by, or will people react differently? Do you?
I think it's a bit of a mix. On one hand, he is equally over exaggerating, in my opinion. But on the other hand, he's wording it in a way that makes it sound plausible. And I think that's a bit of the catch of this show. It sounds plausible enough for people who aren't aware of the Stone Age history. For them, it may sound like, oh, this could actually be a thing, or this could have happened exactly like he says it happened. But when you actually research it, you find the flaws and you find the holes. You can get sucked into it very easily. Sorry, my cats are doing their thing. But I mean, yeah, you can get sucked into it very easily, especially if you're unaware of it, because the show, it looks good. He tells his stories in a way that it's intriguing. He's a very charismatic guy. That doesn't mean that he's right, though. So you can get sucked into it, but I hope that most people that have watched it will also do their own research to form their own opinion and not just take his opinion as fact.
Did you have any issues watching the episodes? I know many in the archaeology field have been wandering holes in their living rooms, shouting at their televisions. Did you feel it was a struggle to watch, or?
Yeah. Honestly, episode 1, first 2 minutes, I paused, walked away from my laptop and told myself, am I really going to do this? I don't want to attack a person. I only want to attack their work, or not even attack, it's a critique. And I don't want to attack anyone or make it sound like I'm attacking anyone. It's just that I very much do not agree with him on not just one or two things, but it's like when I make my scripts, I pause nearly every 30 seconds to write something down. Doesn't mean that it'll be in the end script that I create. It just means that that's how long it takes for me to watch an episode. So an episode of 25 minutes takes me about an hour and a half at least to get through, because I hear something and then I'm like, is that really the case? And then I have to research it, look it up, get all the facts straight, then write something down, then go back. And then within 10 seconds, I'm like, really? Again? Pause. And, you keep... Yeah, it's a thing. I don't recommend doing it. Let's keep it at that. I started this and from the moment I started it, I actually regretted doing it because it's so much work. I normally write my videos from a few scientific papers that are available on a species or a structure, and that's super easy for me because I have my research all cut out. I know what to do, I know what to write, and I can write a script in 8 hours? and be completely done. With this, it's like an hour and a half to watch the show, including some research. Then I have to go back, research deeper, and then try and create a script that's sort of easy to follow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that feeling. You're describing my process basically too. So I'm familiar with that one. It takes some time to put everything together.
I've put some of the articles that have come out by archaeologists and other historians in the field, but I rarely look at them when I'm writing my scripts or watching the show because I don't want their opinion to influence mine.
Yeah.
'Cause I have a strong opinion of my own, but I don't want to take the words of someone else accidentally or things like that.
Yeah, that can be a healthy approach to it. But let's talk a little bit about what he says, not necessarily ad verdum, but what did you find most interesting in the few episodes you have seen so far? It covers a couple of sites. Was there anything you felt, wow, this was exciting, even if it was maybe portrayed a bit faulty?
For me, one of the very few things that I very much enjoyed of the show was the renders, like I think it's like 3D renders of what some of the sites could have looked like in their prime. Those shots I absolutely love. I think the creative team behind it did a fantastic job on them. It looks amazing. It helps me to try and figure out in my mind what things could have looked like in the past. It's something that I've tried to do myself for a long time.
Yeah.
Seeing them in a render on the screen, that to me that's exciting because that it could have looked like that. On the other hand, with the Bimini Road episode 4 episode, I'm very unconvinced. No. But with Gigantia in Malta, I think that looked fantastic. I absolutely think it looked fantastic. And the pyramid in the second episode, that looked good too, the render of that. That looked amazing. And I was like, could have looked like that for sure. Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah, I must say that they actually did bring in some good 3D modelers on the show, and that helps a lot. You know, to get people picturing how it was back then, even if it's not an exact carbon copy of the site, it still, gives some imagination, and those type of projects has been part of archaeology for a quite long time. In reality, it's just that we don't really utilize them as much as we could do, which something we can apply in our own, outreach to the public in a sense. Yeah, but from the episode you have seen, what did you feel was the worst representation of a site or a concept?
The worst representation, I'm afraid I also have to go back to Malta. Because, yes, Malta is very well known by archaeologists. It's extremely well excavated, actually. They research it thoroughly. The archaeologists on Malta and that have worked on Malta in the past have done tremendous work. And he made it look like they barely did anything and they got all their facts wrong, and they just don't want to admit that there was this ancient civilization that took over everything and just built everything and then disappeared. Like, no. It's extremely well known that on Malta, the temples were created by the Neolithic temple builders, and they did an amazing job. And you can even see on other structures on the islands of Malta and Gozo that it wasn't a thing that they just did. It was a gradual thing. There are things older than the massive temples, like some of the dolmens and other sites on the islands that predate Gigantia and Hajar-im and Menaidra, that he didn't look at and didn't show in the Netflix series because that would ruin his story. So I think the worst representation that he gave was the Malta episode so far. I mean, Bimini, it's just, but I mean, everyone knows Bimini is just, it's a fun story, but it's not true. But on Malta, he very much badly represented the work done there.
Yeah, Malta, but you've been on Malta, I think, even
Yep, last year
traveled
in
around. Yeah.
February for 10 days, I've seen all the temples, most of the dolmens, most of the card ruts. I've been inside the Halsaflini Hypogeum. So I've seen things myself with my own eyes. I've been there. I've not touched anything because that's something I don't do. It's all about preservation of these sites.
Is there something you wished that Netflix aired instead of this type of documentary? If you were the producer, what would you make instead for a documentary show?
Honestly, I would have contacted Dr. Lee Berger and asked him to film the excavations in the Rising Star Cave system and all the amazing things on Homo naledi that they found there, and show that process. Show how an actual excavation season goes. Not just one day of an excavation where they might not find anything, but film an entire excavation season and show that to the public. Like, of course, take out the fun stuff and leave out the boring stuff. That's fine. But show people what a real excavation is like.
Yeah.
On the field, with the people, with the experts, show how they speculate about things as they are finding it before they research. Because, of course, they speculate a little bit here and there. And that's fun to see. This might be from this, or this might push to that narrative, or just show the real stuff, show real excavations, show real historians and archaeologists and paleoanthropologists while they are working and not just sitting in front of a camera. Because that's what we currently do when we show them mostly. I mean, when Homo naledi was first discovered, they did film with National Geographic and they showed excavations. The reason my video on Homo naledi blew up was because of that amount of interest, because it was filmed in the past. So people remember seeing it and wanting to know more, wanting to learn about new information that has possibly come out since. I think we should look more on the real stuff and not just the ancient aliens, ancient advanced civilization narrative that honestly is based on nothing.
Yeah, old esoteric text for the most part. And some fantasy stuff.
Well, I like the esoteric part of it. Like I've done this Egypt tour with an on an esoteric tour. So I understand that way of looking at it. But even then, the tour focused on the real history and gave esoteric information on the side. It wasn't about that the esoteric thought of it and thought behind some of the things was like the only way to look at it. We know the excavations, and then we see these symbols, and this is created in a certain way, and that might have this or that meaning. Whether you believe that meaning is up to you. That's how that tour went. So the esoteric part of it, I don't mind. It's just that we need to focus on the real history and real archaeology before we think about an ancient advanced culture that lived on the planet, came from Atlantis, and then went with their boats and everywhere. And then everywhere they went, only one arrived, and sometimes even 9,000 years after Atlantis disappeared. Like, what is your story? Like, giants and no, please no.
Seems to be a difference between using esotericism to add to existing knowledge, but what Graham Hancock and Van Daniken do is to use theosophy, anthroposophy, esoterians as the lens who we look through the myth on. So if people want to hear more from you or view your show, where should they go and find you?
If they want to watch me on YouTube with my thorough videos, they go to History with Kayleigh on YouTube. Very easy to find. Usually when you type History with and just a K, you can find me, because most people can't write my name. On Twitter, I'm Kayleigh History, and on Instagram, History with Kayleigh as well. I also have a Facebook page, but I rarely use it. So don't bother. Don't even bother.
All right, so look her up on Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, Kayleigh, and see you some other time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks again, Kayleigh. Links to her projects can be found in the show notes, but for now we will close the books for this time. But make sure to return next time. The exploration will take us to Göbekli Tepe, Poverty Point, Serpent Mound, and back to Daring Kuyu. We will also be guested by Dr. Kayleigh from the Pseudo Archaeology podcast and maybe some more interesting people. So make sure to tune back in next time. But till then, remember to leave a positive review anywhere you can, such as iTunes, Spotify, or to your friend at the Trench. I also recommend you to visit diggingupancientaliens.com to find more info about me and the podcast, and you can also find me on most social media sites. And if you have comments, corrections, suggestions, or you want to write an email in all caps, you find my contact info on the website. There you will also find all the sources and resources that I use to produce this podcast, and you often find further reading suggestions over there. Sandra Martelor created the intro music. Our outro music is from the band called Trollskruv, who will sing their song Tinfoil Hat. Links to both of these artists can be found in the show notes. Until next time, keep shoveling that science.
Men jag skyddar mig för jag har foliehatt. Och så säger ni det är en galen fantasi att Engels manipulerar oss med telepati. Ni tycker att jag redan är besatt, men jag skyddar mig för jag har
I need to click on my litter box because it's gonna make a noise, and that's not gonna be fun. Loud. Cats. He's always a naughty boy. He's so young and he doesn't understand life, but he's always so naughty when I film anything. Why? Why are you naughty?